To expect that there will be self-regulation right now, not going to happen. Why is it not going to happen? Because the business model for them is subscription. They're going to push the boundaries to get people on board, which is why what you're calling slightly edgy content, lot more edgy content, this, that, and the other. We will continue to see this happen for a while. I don't see this until you've got leaders, until you've got number twos. The space is too nascent right now for them to self-regulate. Not going to happen.
I was going down the path of also on the aspect of the self-regulatory mechanism as such. The code has come about more, I think, as a reaction of what could happen from the government's sort of standpoint when you have a couple of cases going to court and it's the IMA is coming together saying that, look, if we do not have a self-regulatory code, then perhaps something may be forced upon us. So let's just try and figure out something which is acceptable across all stakeholders.
The purpose behind the code was just to adhere to the law of the land, and that is just that. It's just that, and this is a voluntary code that we have adopted just to observe all the rules and regulations of the land, and we are just doing that. It's just a voluntary adoption. We don't want to go beyond that, and we don't want to offend anybody. That's the idea.
You were saying how individuals or platforms would have a self-regulatory code, and then that way individual users would make the choice of sort of segregating or rating the content which is available to either a child or not a child. But my concern is that putting that responsibility on the user is again not fair without a uniform code, because then you say that one user has this issue and has raised such a so-and-so problem with, say, a public policy head of that particular company, and they've settled it via admin, as you said, via their own codes. But then how do you rate that in terms of content? Like if they say they don't want this content or this aspect of this content is, I don't know, is violating some form of exceptions in 19.2, do you just blanket ban it for everyone? Or, I mean, who allows what user gets to decide what's viewable content and what's not? I mean, for that reason, only you need to have a regular and a uniform content code given by the government.
Which is why I say I made a distinction between two parts. One was, of course, the code itself.
Yeah.
The code could be a voluntary code which is enforced amongst its members voluntarily. And that, as I said, is something which they're doing as only as a blanket layer of protection rather than be subjected to being harassed or dragged into court every time. And as I said, it's not something that could work overnight. It may be a work in progress, and over a period of time you will have more such instances of administrative proceedings versus a court proceeding. If you are not subscribing to the voluntary code, you're opening it up, yourself up to possibly more litigation than you would otherwise be.
If there's no uniformity, isn't that making a case for government regulation? And two, if it's going to be, if there's services which are outside the country and they're still accessible in India, how will that be dealt with?
So I think let's look at a situation where we are inviting regulations to the OTT space. What should or what would the regulation look like? So I think Abhishek made a wonderful point, which is about the fact that what were these regulations trying to do so far, the CBFC regulations and also the regulations are relating to cable TV, right? They were not trying to really regulate content, but in fact had some sort of an effect of regulating the content itself, because there were courts which came out as a part of it. The reason why these existing regulations existed in the first place was because the nature of delivery of content itself was very different. It was analog in nature, which gave the user or a family or someone at home very limited choices to essentially control what content they watch, because it was one standard content which was flowing through the network at the same time. But that's not the case with OTT itself. So let's say a regulation needs to come, or or even a self-regulated code needs to come. There is possibility to work around sort of a consent artifact that we talk about even in data, where there is more choice given to the users itself to select by way of selecting these sub-user groups, giving parental permissions, age verification techniques, etc., to ensure that no one below a certain age watches a certain level of content. There will be litigation, there will be questions on whether this content should be allowed or not, which is a completely different question altogether. I don't think we should mix it with the discussion on OTT regulations, because let people fight it out on the court, because it's my right to speak, and if somebody is offended, his right to go to the court and take it down.
could you give us an indication of what has led us to this path or this situation where there's a content code that is being considered by the government? Uh, like, what is the situation that's actually got us into this thing where government is trying to create a code or thinking of creating a code or accepting a self-regulatory code?
Okay, I think the issue actually started with basically one of the global players releasing a series which kind of had a lot of nudity, it had a lot of bad language, and that is what caused all this issue.
So you're talking about Netflix and Sacred Games.
Yeah, means I
You
think I was
okay.
kind of trying to be decent.
Right.
Okay, so I think that is where all this problem started. But going by whatever that you were saying, that having a code of ethics internally, I might have a point of view, but that same point of view might not agree with, I don't know, half the dozen people around India. So how do you kind of define? Because all the stories that we are trying to make or other guys are trying to make is something that is going to be different, something that is basically on the global level. Okay, because today, whatever said and done, we are competing with all the global players. We have to kind of reach those kind of benchmarks. If I have to reach those kind of benchmarks, I have to kind of get into production quality. I need to kind of get into content which is slightly edgy. Okay, I'm not saying that I'm going to get into porn, but at least this has to be slightly edgy, because that's what people want. And if we start getting, censored, etc., to fear, then I don't need to do dhanda, yaar. Then I might as well do something else.
As far as online content is concerned, you cannot be asked to take it down. It's a voluntary code. It's a voluntary practice that every company is established on their own self. So, I mean, there are already various laws that are governing this online content, like Indian Penal Code, right to freedom of speech, or Copyright Act, protection of children from sexual offences, and various others. So, as long as you adhere to these laws, there is nothing that's stopping you from showing content.
No. So I did not say that we did not, means we were kind of worried about taking down the content. Okay, the whole thing is that we did not want any kind of backlashes happening. See, please try and understand that in today's world, especially with social media, etc., okay, and we are an upcoming platform, okay, I cannot kind of compete with the big daddies. So for us, we have to be very careful. The moment I kind of get somebody kind of comes and says that what is the kind of content, we have to be careful. So for us, these are the problems that we face. So that is what I was trying to say.
Okay, so that, I mean, that's a matter of policy, that's a decision, individual company decision.
OTT services is a very broad phrase, and so to my mind, if a film is being, let's say, streamed on, say, Hotstar, and they have the self-regulatory code which they've put together under the IMAI, that same film is going to have the certification there in front, right? There are two questions. One, if I'm the government, how do I ensure that there is uniformity in self-certification? Because these guys are a part of it, but let's say Amazon isn't. And so, and the Karnataka High Court had also said that that there's no enforcement mechanism for this for these codes. So there's one group of people that's got their own code. There's someone who hasn't. Someone can go and put together their own code. If there's no uniformity, then isn't there that in consumer interest for there to be government regulation to ensure uniformity, playing the devil's advocate from the government side?
Sure. So that's one consideration. And I was going to, when you asked me this question, I was going down the path of also on the aspect of the self-regulatory mechanism as such. The code has come about more, I think, as a reaction of what could happen from the government's sort of standpoint when you have a couple of cases going to court and it's the IMA that's coming together saying that, look, if we do not have a self-regulatory code, then perhaps something may be forced upon us. So let's just try and figure out something which is acceptable across all stakeholders. But if you notice that, when I have a Netflix account at least, there is a possibility for someone who's signing in, and supposedly you're supposed to be an adult when you're signing in on that, you can create sub-accounts which are specific, let's say, to your children. So you yourself are exercising that view and that control as to what is the content that is viewable by children and what is it that is viewable by an adult. And when you put that parental lock on that, the children sort of subcategory, automatically the content that is coming up for even as an option to view will necessarily exclude, it should, exclude the adult content. So that level of self-regulatory mechanism is, in that sense, at least on certain platforms, already being enforced. Now, coming to the self-regulatory code, your point is very valid as to whether there should be, and that there is a need definitely to be uniformity, because there should be a level playing field. The whole purpose of a self-regulatory code is,
Well, even the level playing field argument can be across multiple levels.
of course,
right?
sure,
So
I agree. So it's not only within that ecosystem, but it's also between this platform and the others as well, right? That's what, in fact, there's a petition pending in the Delhi High Court also in relation to that, and some of the consultations that have gone about, even on the communications aspect of OTT, have had people coming up and saying, all right, this is fine, but what about the level playing field on the OTT content sort of level?
Right.
So I mean, that's a subject matter of, I think that's a
This
huge
is
other
a
debate.
separate thing,
Yes,
but on this,
correct.
how do you-
Within this itself, the whole purpose of having a self-regulatory code, and I'm giving you an example of what, let's say, the IBF or the NBSA has, BCCC and the Standards Authority within these organizations. What they are ensuring is that there is an alternative mechanism that is available for people who have issues with a program or more, or a channel, to air their grievances at that administrative level and try and have that sorted out there and then, rather than having to knock on the doors of the court. So I think the self-regulatory mechanism gives you that, if I can call it, an additional layer of protection to, let's say, the platform, and an additional forum where the grievances can be aired, and if they've felt to be not of such a magnitude, they can be addressed at that forum itself. So I think that's the more important purpose of the self-regulatory code. And if someone has voluntarily opted out of it, I think they are possibly opening themselves up to then being subject to a more paternalistic, forcibly sort of being asked to toe the line.
they're
and
opening
litigation.
themselves up to direct
Possible
access
litigation.
to court and
Yeah.
therefore litigation.
Perhaps, yeah.
But honestly, the self-regulatory code hasn't stopped people from filing cases against Netflix. I mean, the Indore case, for example,
sure.
recently.
A certain kind of user is appropriately aligned to the content, then that also has to happen at home. So the parent has to decide whether or not the child should be able to watch the content, because at the creator's side, the filters are simply not strong enough right now, and at best they're just guidelines. You have the screen on most shows right now that say, this is going to be parental advisory, there's nudity, there's violence, there's abusive language. All of that exists. All of that is information for the parent to say, okay, kid, you go to your room, or we change the channel, or whatever that is. If that's not in place, then there is no level of regulation which can actually control the fact that if we don't know who is actually watching what content under whose credentials, all of this is just broken.
So I had one question over here, which is again about the UGC platforms, which is that algorithms perform editorial functions, and this regulatory code is particularly applicable to streaming platforms which are performing editorial functions of selecting what content will be shown. And so in that context, if there's a self-regulatory code, what stops that from being made applicable to platforms and content on platforms, because algorithms perform the same function of editorial selection for viewers?
Well, the algorithms are simply not strong enough to make those determinations right now. That's what we're seeing. Yes, they may be able to make some of these determinations.
But functionally, they're doing the same act.
They are, and that's where some of it is problematic, right? Because it is censoring or filtering through content that should not be censored or filtered through. And therefore, you need to have some kind of an additional oversight, or if it is technological, learning-based improvement of the algorithm, so be it. If it's human intervention to evaluate the algorithm's results, so be that. But I don't know what that solution might look like. But at the end of the day, we need to improve what kind of guidance these algorithms are receiving. And for me, as a viewer, I have a problem if the algorithm is going to say, I'm not going to show you something. I'd rather be the judge of what I want to see. And I'd rather be the judge of what I would allow my family members who are probably not in a position to make that decision in an informed manner to see or not see. So I would like to be the person in my home to make that decision.
I would like to get some more clarity, and I guess it would be useful to locate a lot of the questions in the code of best practices that we saw in January this year, that was mediated by IAMAI and also had most major platforms on board, where they sort of gave us an impression of what constitutes prohibited content, which was, which was criticized for being as being very vague in many ways, which said that content that insults the national flag or the national emblem, or that promotes terrorism or hurts religious sentiments, and we know that religious sentiments can be hurt by almost anything. So in that sense, say if a
Just
Gursimran
remember the phrase, everything you say will offend at least someone in this country.
yeah, most probably. Yeah, so in terms of understanding, so we were talking about standards and regulations as well, or the objectives. So if these are the things that are there in the code of best practices that we saw written down in January this year, which is vague, so how do different platforms come to a consensus as to what constitutes any of these violations? So if Gursimran is making something, then how does he understand what promotes terrorism, or that joke with the national flag in the background, what insults the national flag in that case? So I mean, is regulation? I would like some clarity from IMAI or some of the platforms
think
here as
Amita
to
used
how
gone.
they navigate the space of vagueness,
Yeah.
because this is
Understood.
a
So
good question.
I had because since Amita is gone, this is and you're party to the code. The other question which someone I think in our team had put together was that is the code, when it comes to prohibited content, is it applicable upon complaint, or is it at the onset, when content is being aggregated or being licensed or being produced, is it applicable then?
There's a section in the code in the beginning that clearly calls out that there are various laws and acts which are legal colleagues already mentioned, IT Act and IPC and stuff, which are anyway laws of the land which are upheld by all companies, right? So that's where we are. The section on prohibited content also mentions the word deliberately and maliciously, that none of these companies would deliberately or maliciously want to focus on any content which can upset anybody's sentiments. With respect to the parameters listed there, and then back to Nikhil's point that whatever comes out might just upset some people, come what may. So I think it's a very, very subjective question. There's no straight answer that I have. But yes, there is no deliberate or malicious intent to hurt anybody.
See, the purpose behind the code was just to adhere to the law of the land, and that is just that. It's just that, and this is a voluntary code that we have adopted just to observe all the rules and regulations of the land, and we are just doing that. It's just a voluntary adoption.
Yeah, I have a short question to the room in general. So what happens if there are multiple self-regulatory codes in place? In this IMAI code was signed by a bunch of like 5 to 6 players. Then you may have 2-3 other such codes which may differ in their content, and what happens then?
So I'll give you an example. Something might be 16 plus for one platform, 18 plus for another platform. How does that work is basically the question, right?
And adding to that, the question raised by someone there that anyway, it's not like the codes are very exhaustive. They are subject to interpretation. So there's going to be a lot of confusion.
That goes back to the question I was asking earlier, that because of this lack of uniformity, is there then going to be a situation where the government will want to
does
come
it
and
encourage
enforce
the
the code?
government to step in and say, okay, now we are here to save
Because
you
there's an
all?
ambiguity in place.
Yeah.
See, if you look at the news, the News Broadcasting Association self-regulatory code, that the government feels it's not done a good job, and they're not happy with it.
No, absolutely, and there are instances
There are instances.
where broadcasters have left that association because they don't want to comply with the code.
Exactly.
On the other hand, you have BCCC, which is the entertainment side, which the government feels has done a very good job. So, if normally what is happening is that if there's a critical complaint, it is in the case of the entertainment side, it is referred to the BCCC because the government feels they'll do an adequate job. Whereas in the case of the NBA side, the government generally takes their own action as per
Honestly,
their.
as a journalist, I can tell you that if the government feels you're doing a good job, then that's not necessarily a great thing. But
No, but
I
even the courts have vouched it. So I mean, the courts have endorsed it. So that's it's not just the government.